all eyes will be on the outcomes of the 15th BRICS Summit, which kicks off in Sandton today. The bloc represents about 42% of the world's population and 32% of global GDP. Between 2016 and 2022, trade between South Africa and fellow partners grew tremendously.
In fact, it averaged around 7% a year. Now, trade also reached $50.1 billion last year. A common currency has also been proposed to lessen the dollar's dominance in global commerce, making global trade more accessible. Let's get you a sense of what to think about in the lead-up to the beginning of the summit. Our business editor, Xolani Mbanjwa, is part of our team at the Sandton Convention Centre and joins us now live. And Xolani, as we take in these visuals of a hive of activity outside the convention centre, take us through how global markets specifically have responded to how BRICS has grown.
Good morning, Ayanda. Well, since the start of BRICS in the late 2000s, you will remember that there was a lot of skepticism. Not a lot of people gave the BRICS bloc of nations any chance at all to survive because of geopolitics. But when South Africa eventually joined in 2009, it was a seminal moment that has brought us to this position where South Africa is the chair of the BRICS bloc of nations. So there has been a lot of skepticism, particularly as you speak about the new currency. A lot has been said about the countries that are part of BRICS already starting to move towards when they trading in local currencies. And we've seen Russia using their rupees to actually trade when it comes to oil. It is something that has sent rattles throughout the world, particularly for those who are using the dollar, and everybody uses the dollar to actually trade as the fallback currency of the world. And if there is those kind of changes that come through when most countries demand to trade in those currencies, in their own currencies, it has sent shockwaves around the world. But the new currency might not be a new thing right now, but we expect to hear exactly what the world leaders think about creating a new currency here. Here is how one market analyst has viewed these particular developments around BRICS bloc of nations. Petri Regeling-Hayes at Herenya Capital Partners.
From the sort of collective BRICS perspective, we're starting to become a bit more powerful than the West, the traditional West, right? Which is an interesting development to start off with. But now what's starting to happen is there's a long list of countries that are queuing up and applying to join the BRICS sort of, alliance. Well, not really alliance, but economic alliance, right? Or trade bloc. So that is further expansion of the BRICS. So essentially what happens is BRICS nations, China, Russia, India, South Africa, Brazil, and all the ones that will be joining, are becoming increasingly more important and more powerful in the global trade, sort of arena. So I think that it's going to be a very interesting decade that lays ahead, and I'm quite keen to see what the outcome of this BRICS summit is going to be. If they continue to push for our own BRICS currency, where we have, like a euro situation, I wonder how that plays out for South Africa, because we've had a situation where the rand continues to weaken and weaken and weaken and weaken over the last 30 years, over the last 40 years, essentially. And it's lost an enormous amount of its buying power. So if we do get a, I guess, precious metal-backed currency, which is what the talk is about, I would like to see how that plays out for us, right? I think that could potentially be a good thing.
Yeah, market commentator there, Petri Regeling-Hayes there, speaking, Xolani, about the possible growth of BRICS in the form of new countries coming on board. But as we take stock of that, remind us again of the composition of BRICS currently and perhaps South Africa's position in it.
Brazil is, for all intents and purposes, one of those emerging economies that has been likened to South Africa in terms of its make-up. And when you look at how big these countries are, Brazil having such a large population, but of course the other countries that have the biggest populations in the world, being Russia, we know how big they are. 1.4 billion people in that country. They are actually having one of the worst times economically due to sanctions, but it hasn't deterred them because Europe has still continued to rely on them for gas and oil imports, and actually grain as well. And if you look at India being another huge populous country, you will remember it is just changing positions, number one and number two with Russia. It also has just over 1.4 billion people with I think over $2 trillion in terms of its GDP. And when you look at China, it is one of the big ones as well, with that many people, 1.4 billion people as well. It is one of the big countries and the second biggest economy in the world, and it is a good thing to be having these bilateral agreements and memoranda of understanding when it comes to technology, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to the best possible practice, when it comes to energy. Some things that we should expect here to be discussed is that energy transition, how South Africa could get that sort of help. And the Minister of Electricity will be here as well, Dr. Khoshenso Ramokgopa, to also talk about some of the things that will be discussed. So when you look at China being still an emerging economy, it is quite surprising that we have that big a country with over 16 trillion US dollars in GDP per year. And when it comes to South Africa's position within BRICS, it is not looking good when it comes to trade. We import more to the BRICS bloc of nations than we export. It is an unfair trade imbalance there, something that government has spoken about, including the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Ibrahim Patel, that this is something that South Africa needs to basically deal with, and that's because if you import more than you are exporting, you are basically importing inflation, and we know the story of inflation of the past 18 months at least. So when it comes to South Africa's position within BRICS, it hasn't looked good for a while, and particularly when it comes to trade, it's something to talk about.
All right, Xolani Mbanjwa, thanks very much indeed. A hive of activity at the Sandton Convention Centre, where we're told it is the richest square mile on the continent. I wonder to what extent that fact still rings true. But for now, Xolani, thanks very much indeed.